Hi, I'm Laura Purdy Salas, and I am going to share a few thoughts about the picture book writing and editing process using my three, at this moment, brand new picture books, sort of as examples and case studies. So my three picture books that have all come out within a 3-month period are In the Middle of the Night from Wordsong, Lion of the Sky from Millbrook, and Snowman minus Cold equals Puddle from Charlesbridge. Although they all came out at the same time, within 3 months of each other, they all happened at a very different pace and path toward publication. And I talk about that a little bit in a different video. On this one, I just want to share a little bit more about my thoughts in the writing process and also the editor and what part they played in the book. So I'm going to try to just sum up a little bit about each book. In the Middle of the Night, Poems from a Wide Awake House is published with Wordsong. My fantastic editor is Rebecca Davis. Beautiful illustrations by Angela Madison. And so this idea came about basically, I had written a poem about a party that takes place in a bookstore overnight when there are no people there and it's just the books having a grand old time. And also a little poem that somebody wrote on my blog about chalk coming to life at night. And so that sparked the idea of, all of a kid's belongings. What do they do at night while he or she is asleep? So I wrote dozens of poems. I mean, I'm sure I wrote at least 50 poems, and perhaps more. And I was going for I wanted a variety of poetic forms. I wanted kind of a variety of moods, and I wanted it to be really just really fun and mischievous. And my editor, Rebecca Davis, oh my gosh, she was so instrumental, first of all, in the kind of the arc of this book. I had my poems grouped, I believe, by room, but she really strengthened that. And she thought about what would go, what rooms were missing and what order within each room. She managed to look at the big picture of this book and see what was needed, what kinds of things were missing from this house and from this experience, and which poems played off each other well. So her revision letters were just amazing, very detailed, but never, never suggesting what I do, just saying, oh, I would love to see, I don't know, more emotion, or this part wasn't quite clear for me, or things like that. Part of her job also was suggesting poems to be cut because I had too many of them. So here's one pair of poems that she suggested we cut, and she's brilliant, so I went along with that. This is about the missing sock from your dryer. And the first poem is called Sock Tragedy. We were just having fun. We tumbled and spun a whirling game of chase. She giggled and cheered. Then my twin disappeared. She's lost without a trace. And then the response poem from the missing poem's point of view is Three's a Crowd. Oh, don't be dramatic. It's nothing traumatic. It's just that we can't always spend every spare moment playing. I guess what I'm saying is I finally made a new friend. We were swinging and flinging. I found myself clinging to a pair of green corduroy pants. He sings to me, zip. We're attached at the hip. We're a warm, fuzzy whirlwind romance. So that one got cut. Lion of the Sky. So my editor on this one is Carol Hins at Millbrook. we have a pretty long relationship together. We've made a number of books together. And she is so smart and so thoughtful. Um, and this collection, um, because the poems are short, so they're called riddleku, they're haiku that are riddle poems. And so any one revision changes a poem a lot. And because the poems are so short, also sometimes I would submit, 2 or 3 poems for the same topic. So Fireworks, for instance, is one of the summer poems. And, uh, I wrote many haiku or riddleku about each topic. My little notebook has often, 3 to 5 versions of haiku for the same topic. And usually I chose my favorite to include, to show to Carol. But there were some times when I would just come out and ask her, I like both of these and I can't decide, what do you think? And she would say, oh, I think this one's much stronger or something. As I was writing these, I had a few priorities. First of all, they're seasonal poems, and I really wanted to capture something essential to that season, something iconic. Then I wanted to give enough clues that the reader could make a good guess just from the text alone without seeing the art. And finally, I wanted the poems to be beautiful. I wanted them to pack impact and have power and beauty in just 17 syllables, like any haiku would, even if it was not a riddle. So as is my habit, I sent, way more poems than we could use. So here are a couple of poems that didn't make the cut. And they're both from summer. I had a lot of summer poems. I'm a splintered dock, a hook, a line, and a long time. Then fast flash of fin. And the answer to that riddle coup is fishing. And the second one, another one, is blanket and basket. Inside, sandwich, juice, napkins. Outside, adventure. So I have a lot of riddleku left that didn't make the cut. Not sure what I'm going to do with them, but I have leftovers. And then, of course, even once we had which poems were going to be in the book, Carol still gave me feedback, and I was still revising. So I search under oaks for tiny, tasty treasures. Winter is coming. And the answer is it's a squirrel gathering acorns. And so Carol wrote, I wonder if we can tell a little more about what that squirrel is doing in this line. A few ideas: and store up tasty treasures, and gather tasty treasures, collecting tasty treasures. And when I read her, this is often the case when you're working with, great editor, you read their comment and often you think, well, of course, that's exactly what I should have done. And so I realized that searching under oaks for tiny, tasty treasures, while I thought it was detailed when I wrote it, and I liked the alliteration. I get a little caught up in alliteration. So I really liked the alliteration of tiny, tasty treasures. But for my audience of, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, that maybe a little more clue was needed, a little more information. You never want your poems to be full of filler. And as soon as I read Carol's line of, and gather tasty treasures, I knew that that was the right line to use. And she was not saying that I needed to pick one of those 3. She was just giving me some ideas to use as a springboard for my own line. However, if you talk to any teacher or any first grader and you say, what does a squirrel do with acorns? He gathers up acorns. Gather is kind of an iconic word in itself when you're talking about fall and squirrels, because that is just really how it is almost always described. So I search under oaks and gather tasty treasures. Winter is coming. Carol Hines really should have a co-author byline there. Here's another example. We are knitted twins, soft as kittens, warm as love, waiting to hold hands. And she said, and this went with the word love, it didn't come through on the screen, but this was attached to love. I wonder if this is just a little too abstract to be very effective as a clue. Do you want to brainstorm some other possibilities? Well, I knew what she meant, and maybe I could have said warm as a blanket or something, but there's just only so many warm things, and several of them in the winter, and several of them I mentioned in other poems already. And I decided that I liked hugs, because really hugging is kind of what a mitten does to your hands. So I changed it to we are knitted twins, soft as kittens, warm as hugs, waiting to hold hands. And then a huge part of the, oh dear, sorry, I disappeared off the screen and I don't know why, but y'all don't need to see me anyway. A huge part of the revision process in Lion of the Sky centered around punctuating the haiku. And we looked at a number of other picture book haiku collections to see the different ways that other authors and other editors and publishers had handled the punctuation. And the main things we were discussing were, should there be uppercase letters at the beginning of each line? And should there be sentence punctuation? In other words, if the words in a haiku, like we are knitted twins, soft as kittens, warm as hugs, waiting to hold hands, should there be a period at the end of that? Because grammatically speaking, that does form a complete sentence. So should it start with a capital W? And so we had these awesome emails back and forth, and it's amazing how much time and energy went into this. But when your poems are very short, you know, every mark on the page matters. And my feeling pretty strongly was that I wanted them to be as delicate and almost ephemeral as possible, and I didn't want them weighed down with capital letters at the beginning of the line, and I didn't want to use sentence punctuation and have a period at the end or an exclamation mark and be held to the idea of making them all into sentences. But I also knew, you know, that I might not have the final say on that. And Carol is smart and loves poetry. And so I valued, you know, her opinion a lot. And as we talked back and forth about the pros and cons of different approaches and what effect different kinds of punctuation and capitalization, what effect it had on how the reader takes in that poem, we eventually came to agree that no uppercase letters unless it's I, and no sentence punctuation, that I would use punctuation as needed for clarity of reading. So if I needed a dash or an ellipsis or something like that, then that was fine. But we didn't use, you know, capital letters and periods. And I was so happy. Okay, snowman minus cold equals puddle. So that one, I played around with those a lot before it ever made it, you know, before it ever got submitted. So my idea started out as equations as a format. bees plus flower equals honey, a short equation, then a longer prose explanation, all science related. That was what was in my idea document. However, when I started spewing out equations, and these were so much fun, I mean, I wrote tons of equations, hundreds of equations. And I started seeing that I was writing on all sorts of topics, not just science topics. I had some about imagination and learning and friendship and home and many science topics. At one point I thought, or there could be a narrative throughout a year, or a connection, like the last word of each equation is the first word in the next equation. Wow, wouldn't it, if I could do all that, wouldn't that be cool? But I couldn't do all that. I couldn't make it work. But here's an example. Here are a few examples of just the many different kinds of equations I was writing. Rock plus Colorado River times 2 billion years equals the Grand Canyon. Pizza divided by friends equals sharing. Dinosaurs plus meteor equals goodbye. That's still one of my favorites. So I had, just this conglomeration of a million equations, but they weren't cohesive enough. And picture books really have to be cohesive. So then I thought, okay, what if I look at a park and I write some equations for each season in that park? And these are just a few bits of the many equations I wrote around each season. And it felt like it was still too much in one picture book. And I did not submit that equation to anybody. So then I thought, well, what if I narrow it down to a single season? And I decided to choose spring for a couple of reasons. One reason is that equations, at their core, equations are about transformation. They are about how we change each other. And spring feels like the season of greatest transformation. And another reason is fall, which also is a season of great transformation. But there are so many beautiful picture books about fall. Now, there are beautiful picture books about spring too, but I feel like spring hasn't been done as much as fall. So I decided to focus on spring. And I wrote my equations. I submitted the manuscript. And I submitted it actually without the prose sidebars. I don't know, because I didn't want to write the sidebars unless an editor was interested in it. However, I not only didn't write them, but I didn't even mention them in my cover letter to Alyssa Pusey, my fabulous editor. And so she was like, oh, I love these equations. I feel like there needs to be more like sidebars. I was like, oh yeah, I meant to mention that. And so the way these came about is sometimes I would end up with I would start with the finish, like a woodpecker's pecking reminded me of a drum. And so I would ask myself, what things come together to create that drum? And in my equation, it is bark plus beak equals drum. Other times I had the elements first and then, tried to figure out what the answer was. What's the solution? And so in this one, talons plus pond equals. What I was picturing in my head was, well, a picture much like this, but the draft I submitted had talons plus pond equals fish sticks, which I loved because, kids eat fish sticks. And so I thought that was awesome. However, the editorial team, came back and said, gosh, it feels a little too literal, like it is a stick of fish. Can you see what else you can come up with? And so I, played around and brainstormed, and I came up with fast food because it's almost like a drive-through window. It's kind of a dive-in window. And Alyssa, my editor, loved it even more than fish sticks, which she had been on board with before anyway. So a lot of times it was just a question of, this doesn't quite work, can you try something else? These equations are so short, there isn't a whole lot of room for, this part of it doesn't work to me. It's kind of like it works or it doesn't. Although one thing she did have me do, I mean, she had me do a lot of things, don't get me wrong, but I do remember one aspect in particular was trying to make sure that more of them were playful, that they had that spark of surprise in them. Oh, I did want to share something else. Oh, and that was, okay, so in this book, Snowman minus cold equals puddle, the sidebars are super important, and I don't have one on in the slideshow, but I'm going to share one with you, because the equations themselves hopefully make sense, especially along with the art. However, there's a lot of condensing of ideas going on when you shrink down a big transformation or idea into just, 4 or 5 words. And so the sidebars give the scientific background, but I wanted the sidebars to be really lovely language and playful and fun to say. And it's been super gratifying that several of the reviews have actually mentioned the sidebars and how fun they are and how rich they are in language. So I'm so excited that they are seen as an integral part of this, not just oh, and here's a few facts for more information. So one equation is frogs plus night equals symphony. And then here's the sidebar. In the spring, male frogs croon their hearts out to an audience of female frogs. Different species have unique voices, like the different instruments of an orchestra. Gray tree frogs chirp high and fast like piccolos. Bullfrogs honk low and loud on their watery trombones. So all 3 of these books were just such a pleasure to write, and I'm just thrilled with how they came out. Thanks for letting me share a little bit of my process with you. Each of these books has a page on my website where you can learn more about them. And you can connect with me through my website if you're interested, or on Twitter. And thanks so much for listening to a little bit of my writing and the editorial process for these 3 books.